Hey, I want to try and talk about social conditioning, but I won't be bothered if I find a more interesting tangent and follow that instead. The thing about social conditioning is it's so deep. It's so hard to recognize when you have social conditioning in certain contexts. For example, let's look at the example of veganism and eating meat, where, from the point of view of the normal omnivore who encounters a vegan person, is that this is a very strange person who, well, not necessarily, but this is a person who only sort of eats vegetables, and that's kind of, good for them. It's kind of a nice fantasy, and it's kind of trendy, and the thing is, they do a mental sort of calculation to see, to kind of try and evaluate, is that a reasonable thing to do? And they think that they might be making an unbiased estimation of, is it a reasonable thing to never eat meat again and only eat vegetables? And they don't have any idea that actually they can't make an unbiased opinion. They're simply incapable in their normal state of mind of seeing outside their own conditioned self, unless they've had some kind of drastic experience that left a significant impression on them, or they're, for example, in some kind of altered state of consciousness. But most people are terrible at seeing outside their own social conditions. And it's quite a broad term, but the degree to which our behavior as people is conditioned is immense. I mean, this can be expanded to say, like, people don't only make biased judgments about the possibility of other dietary lifestyles, they also make biased assessments of something as simple as their cravings. Someone who's not even addicted, someone who just has a habit of, your normal Western diet. If they get a craving to have a specific cheeseburger, they can of course evaluate their craving and say, oh no, I should probably be on a diet. What could I eat? Maybe a salad and some cheese and no carbs or something. But they can't really evaluate that craving as something. They can't evaluate the food behind the craving, like their particular taste preferences for that food. They can't evaluate those preferences as being conditioned. They just think that those preferences are real, they're those are their preferences because that's the best option, and they prefer the things that are best, and they can of course tell what's the best. But that's ultimately the problem. They can't see outside themselves. It's like Frank Yang talks about Gödel's incomplete theorem, which says that a system that has to use itself to understand itself is always going to have something missing. And like, it's often, that theorem's often applied to the context of the mind, which is the brain or the mind has to use itself to understand itself. So there's something incomplete in that equation. It's not going to be always able to see itself from an external perspective. So that's what happens to us as humans in our psychology. We get conditioned to behave and to prefer things that are just placeholders. Those things could be anything. It's like that episode of The Simpsons where it's a treehouse of horror and the toaster breaks and they keep teleporting to different realities where it's mostly the same but something slightly different. And and Homer comes into a slightly different reality and his family are used to that reality and he's not, and that freaks him out, even though it's mostly the same, it's just slightly different. That's kind of, I feel like that's teaching an important lesson, that certain things could be completely different and we would not know the difference. As the Truman Show says, we accept the reality with which we are given. We get conditioned to the circumstances of which we live in. And the thing about that is, it's completely malleable. And it's malleable, but it's also kind of rigid. It's technically really malleable, but in practice, it's hard to mold and to change once things have set in and dried. Powerful psychedelics can really catalyze that process, but without that, it's really hard. I mean, other things that can trigger a drastic reassessment other than psychedelics are like, grief, maybe, travel, some kind of dramatic, bizarre series of coincidences or unlikely occurrences. Near-death experiences can trigger that sort of thing. Mental or psychological trauma. There's a few things, but in general, if you just say to someone, I want you to try reassessing your preferences for something such as your food or even your taste in entertainment completely, just flip those things on their head for a period of 90 days or something, like a pretty substantial period of time. If you just ask someone to do an experiment like that just to see how difficult it is, they're probably going to not do it. They're probably just going to try, realize it's basically impossible, and rationalize the fact that it's impossible as that they don't need to try something else, because what would be the point of that anyway? What they're doing now is obviously the best way to live. So this experiment's dumb. That's an example of rationalization, but really it's convoluted and it's going to be personalized, every kind of rationalization. But occasionally you're going to get some kind of person who's really determined to do that kind of thing. And I think what I'm trying to say is a person like that who's capable of carrying out an experiment as drastic like that on a whim is going to be a pretty special person. Now, if they don't have previous experience doing that kind of thing, it's going to be even less likely that they would be able to complete a challenge like that. What I'm trying to say is, we're stubborn creatures of habit, and habit's hard to break. Especially subtle habit that you don't even realize is a habit. What do I mean by that? What's a subtle habit that you don't even realize? Just basic things. Like, use your imagination, you know? But yeah, social conditioning is a huge topic, an immense topic, and a fascinating one. And I'm not necessarily going to be able to cover it all on this one train of thought, especially talking by myself into a microphone. But I am fascinated by social conditioning. Yeah, I think psychologists in general enjoy toying with social conditioning, but at the same time, it's fascinating because you know, your average psychologist is socially conditioned in a huge number of ways and won't exactly reinvent their own life on a whim. They just play with it in little experiments, manipulating subtle variables, like, you know, take any social psychology experiment where you, for example, the one where you get people to look at the two different lengths of a line, and when everyone else says the two different lines which are different are actually the same, then people go along with it. And what I'm trying to say is, in theory, a social psychologist, well, not necessarily. I mean, yeah, in theory, a social psychologist should be these crazy, shamanic, wacky, bold, eccentric, esoteric people. But most of the time, they're not. At least in my experience. Now, I think that's enough for now. Take care.